Hello, everybody coming online this morning. I'm happy to see some new faces joining, some familiar ones as well. Good morning in Australia and Southeast Asia. Good afternoon on the west coast of the US. Good evening on the east coast. And hello, it's very late. Good night if you're tuning in from Europe. It is 10 a.m. here in Sydney on Friday morning, and it is a beautiful day. And while we're waiting for more people to join, I would love to hear where you're tuning in from. So if you can pop your name in the chat and the country or the city that you're located in, I'd love for all of us to get a sense of how global this healing revolution is. And that's the name of today's session, Healing Revolution, Trauma Work as the Path of Innovation. And while we're waiting for a few more people to tune in, I'd love to just share a little bit of an update about my year. It's been a while since I've done one of these lives. It's been a big year of innovation for me, relocating in a very non-linear, indirect way from Singapore back to my hometown, Sydney, in Australia. And on the path of getting here, where I really feel like I've just landed, I've been traveling all over the world, teaching in Singapore and LA and New York, hanging out in Austin, Texas, a quick visit to Miami, London, writing chapters for my next book in Croatia and Greece. I'm at 85,000 words now, and then back again teaching in the US and Singapore and Brisbane, back in Australia, and even popping to Uluru for a dear friend's wedding, which for those of you who don't know Uluru, it is sacred Indigenous land in Australia's Northern Territory. So it's been this epic year. And as I've been traveling around, meeting people and listening to people, whether as a teacher, a facilitator, or a therapist, or just as a human, moving in circles, I've really felt this movement, this quickening, this increase in humans who are choosing healing as a way of life. And all of the weird, messy, unknown stuff that comes up when we do this. So I thought now that I have landed back here in Sydney to ground, it would be really cool to do a session where we explore what is this movement that we are feeling? What is this healing revolution? And how can we start to think of our healing or our trauma work as a path of innovation? So that's what today's session is going to be all about. And I can see some of you are tuning in from Canberra, from Sunshine Coast, Melbourne in Australia, Portugal. You're up very late. Thank you for joining. And Seattle, Washington. So it's beautiful to already feel the connective pathways all over the globe. Canada, hello. Please do keep sharing. I think it's really beautiful and meaningful for all of us to know that sitting in our homes all over the world, there are more of us that are connecting to this work. So let's get into today's session. As always, I welcome your questions, your feedback, your counterpoint, your reflections. It's always in the texture of our conversations where the most beautiful thought comes up and that innovation can begin. No one can do this alone. So we are here doing it together.
Have a great
So
time.
if you do have a question or a reflection, please do pop it in the chat. And two of my beautiful team members are online today. So we have Marianne, who's from Singapore, but currently in Adelaide. And she's going to be collating your questions. And there'll be certain moments where I pause through the session. And she will see if there are a few that I can answer. And also saying a big hello and welcome to Tracy, who is very new on Team Illuma Health, Illuma Vision, Natalia, Rachel, and she is learning how to do what Marianne is doing. So she's there in the background as well. So let's get started on today's session. Welcome to the Healing Revolution. We are in the midst of a healing revolution. It's a quickening, it's a movement. There's more of us who are realizing that the key to our peace, our power, our liberation lies in our own healing work. And so does the collective paradigm shift that so many of us crave. When I first started working in this field, which is quite a while back now, and talking about trauma, nobody wanted to listen. In fact, people were somewhat repelled by the word. But now, more and more people are leaning in. The word trauma is everywhere. And sadly, it's kind of losing its meaning. That happens when things become buzz or they become popularized. And in some places, it is also being weaponized, which we may come back to talk on this a little more later, but really it could be a whole session of its own. The thing is, when we do our healing work, process our trauma and transform it into our unique gifts, because that's exactly what happens as part of post-traumatic growth, the person we are or that we were, that version of ourselves, in a way, ceases to exist. We reform, we reorganize, we recalibrate. And the world that we've been living in, co creating, will also change as part of the process. For some, it may be a kind of slow burn, a redrawing slowly of the blueprint, while for others, it may be a spontaneous kind of shattering of who we were, and all of a sudden we're in this unknown new body, new personality, new world, and we don't quite know what to do with it. The moment we choose our healing, no matter which way it happens, we say a hard no to living in ways that hurt, quiet, or disempower. We say a hard no to people, relationships, or systems that want to keep us stuck, disempowered, or unwell. And when we say that hard no, there will always be side effect, a response, a reaction, an aftermath, sometimes a crisis. And it's at this point where we reach a fork in the road. We either can't handle the heat, the fire, the mess, and the uncertainty of it all, and we go back. We go back to the dynamics that don't serve us, that don't serve our healing. Or we bravely walk forward the path unknown and find a better, more harmonic, more peaceful, more vital way to be here together. The path unknown is a path of innovation. And that's exactly what many of us are walking right now. It's actually really exciting. Sometimes it feels quite horrid. The point of talking about trauma is not to keep talking about trauma. It is to innovate ourselves, our relationships, our systems, our businesses, our politics. And that's all I'll be saying about that. Unhealed trauma decontextualizes at all of these levels. Our healing also decontextualizes at all of these levels. It's time that we see trauma work as a doorway to a new way of co-creating our world. It's process, not pathology. That's really important. So over the course of today's session, we're going to explore some different dimensions and what innovation may look or feel like on each of those dimensions. And I'm going to pause after we explore each dimension and open for questions. So if you have questions that are coming through, please do put them into the chat so that I can address them and we can make this a real conversation rather than me just speaking at a screen, because that's not what I want to do. I want to communicate with you. I want to converse with you. And at the same time as we pause for questions, I've prepared, or Marianne has prepared, some links to share with you for resources that if you're particularly interested in this space and you want to go deeper, you can actually access these resources to learn more, to get more curious, to go deeper into healing in this particular dimension. There's so much that I've created over the years, and I really want to encourage you to tap the resources that are available. Let's talk about personal innovation. When we heal, we actually self-innovate. So one of the biggest things that happens when we do our healing work, our personal trauma work, is that we start to experience a change in perception. So this is all about safety versus threat. Many of us who are walking the world with a lot of unresolved trauma experience from a baseline of threat, of fear, of protection, or we are recurrently triggered into it. And so when we are seeing or perceiving the world through this lens of threat, fear, and protection, it makes it very hard to lean into or even identify anything as healthy or good or human or wonderful. And instead, we start seeing a world full of perpetrators and a world full of potential problems. And we become a rolling reaction to threat. And any of you who have read my book, Why Am I Like This, will know that that is how I lived the best part of my life. Just this rolling, complex reaction to threat. Many of us are experiencing like this now. And so, one of the first things that happens when we heal is that we start to rewire our perceptive pathways so we actually can learn, what does safety feel like? What does peace feel like? What does harmony feel like? And it can be quite complex because it's almost as if our wires are completely crossed. So we'll be primed to seek threat, to seek chaos, to seek distress, and it will feel familiar and therefore safer than the wildly unknown kind of safety and connection and peace that we perhaps have never even had a template for. So this is perhaps the biggest and first piece, personal innovation. And this is where somatic work can come in very, very handy in working with our own perceptive and processing pathways. One of the next things that happens when we're in this sort of self-innovation phase is that we develop greater conscious awareness. So we're able to kind of watch our experience rather than only be in it. We can become more aware of our emotions, of others' emotions, and we can become more aware of those survival responses and our tendency to project or transfer onto other people or experiences. So we catch ourselves walking with the trauma, and we learn to hold ourselves back and say, this isn't a true current lens. This is something I'm bringing from the past. And breaking that transference of past, present, and projection onto the world is actually how we completely break the cycle and stop living in this intergenerational rolling trauma response that so many of us are living in. Another thing that happens is that we work on increasing our capacity. So many of us have very little capacity for emotional distress or for activation. And so as we heal, we learn to sit with ourselves. We learn, actually, it's safe for me to experience this. And therefore, I do not even need to repress it and dissociate from it, which will often have an adverse effect later on. But I'm also not going to leak or project it onto others. So as we do our work, we build our capacity and we learn, actually, I'm safe here in the world and I'm safe with this experience. I can metabolize it. Another thing that happens during our process of self-innovation is we start exploring boundaries. We have a lot more no's, not only with others, but with ourselves. So we learn to say no to people that are asking for things from us that really don't support our collective or personal well-being. But we also learn to have good boundaries with ourselves. And that links back to being able to process that experience of threat and survival. Another side effect of our personal innovation is increased compassion. So many of us hold incredibly shaming voices inside our heads, and it either reduces as we heal, that shaming voice is either less intense, less loud, or less frequent, or perhaps to begin with, we're better at countering it. We're better at saying, that's not how I wish to speak to myself or treat myself. This is counterproductive. And this links into the concept of reparenting. As we self-innovate, we automatically start having a different perspective or perceptive experience of the world. And we slowly begin to shift the way we walk through it and the way we connect and the way we co-create. So I'm going to pause now and just see if there are any questions that have come through. Marianne? And I'm also going to ask you to share a couple of resources for people that are interested in this personal dimension. So we're sharing links to some Spotify somatic meditations that will actually help you start to rewire your perceptive pathways, and also a video series that is, again, a somatic series that's going to help you slowly come home to your body and rewire that trauma from the inside out. So I can see she shared them there in the chat. So do be sure to copy those if you want to use them. Are there any questions right now, Marianne?
Not at the moment, so just feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll bring them up again.
Yeah, I would love to hear from some of you. I don't want to listen to the sound of my voice for an entire hour. That would be terrible. Let's move on to the second dimension, which is relationships. Trauma travels through relationships. If we're holding unprocessed trauma, it's very likely that it is informing the quality of our relationships. One of the things that is a hallmark of trauma is that we experience relationship dysfunction. So this might be having emotional volatility or really disconnected relationships where there's really no intimacy available or reciprocity available. And again, it can show up as these really inequitable dynamics where one person's giving and giving and giving and the other person is not. There can be relationships that are very lacking, very neglectful, very unloving. And there can also be a common theme of relationships that have high-low cycles. They're incredible one moment and then they're awful the next moment, and it just keeps going like that. And that actually mirrors a disorganized coactivative response in our nervous systems. When we do hold trauma, on this unconscious level, and if it stems from past relational trauma, which it so often does, one of the things that happens in our relationships is that we have these trauma replays. So unconsciously, a part of us that has experienced relational trauma is actually entering relationships seeking exactly the same thing because that's what it knows, or seeking resolution, trying to work it out. And it's usually these relationships where there's a lot of triggering and a lot of ping ponging back and forth and a lot of needs going unmet and a lot of confusion and a lot of shame. Is like, why is it like this? Why is it so bad? Why can I not have this loving, harmonic connection? Many of us are living in trauma bonds. Many of us that have not done sort of the deep relational trauma processing healing work are existing in trauma bonds. A trauma bond is classified as a strong emotional attachment that forms between a person and someone who abuses or mistreats them. And this bond happens because the person feels hurt and confused and scared and dependent on the abuser or the mistreater, making it really hard for them to leave the harmful relationship. So many of us that have experienced any kind of trauma early on and have not processed it end up in relationships that have similar signatures that are going on. And I've been in plenty of trauma bonds, so I know all about this. And learning to break that cycle requires really, really deep origin work of learning what relationship is, what relationship isn't, what safety looks like, what boundaries are, and what it means to actually receive, which so many of us truly don't know. When we start to heal, our relationships will change. What direction they go in, we don't know. So if we are in a disconnected or a volatile or inequitable relationship, the moment that we do our healing work and stop playing into that cycle and process what we need to process, many different outcomes are possible. So sometimes a relationship can equalize and can become more harmonic. Sometimes our own healing inspires the other person to do their healing, but sometimes our healing actually triggers and activates somebody else's wounds or shadows so much. And in that case, relationships can become more volatile and sometimes do end. So this is a very, very tricky space, but there will be a shift of one kind of another when we do our healing work. The future of healthy relationships is all about containment, accountability, and compassionate care. So it's about saying, well, this is me and this is all of my stuff, my psychological junk. And this is you and all of your stuff and your psychological junk. Let's give each other some radical honesty, but also some hardcore grace. So, the future of relationships is not about trying to metabolize somebody else's stuff so that we can have a relationship. And it's really important that we get super clear on this. And it's hard. It's hard because so many relationships are built upon these trauma foundations. And what we need to learn is, well, this is my work to do, and this is yours. And hope that everyone involved is going to do the work. But sadly, not everybody is always ready to do the work at the same time. Now, I'm going to pause again and see if there are any questions and get Marianne to share a couple of resources for those of you who are interested in this particular relational space. The first is an article that I wrote some years back called Maps to Relational Safety. So if you're currently in a relationship, and these relationships are not only romantic, they can happen in family, within friendship, and they can also happen in the workplace as well. They happen more commonly where there's attachment paradigm or when there is an authority paradigm going on. These are the two places where we're likely to trigger this old relational stuff to process. So she's going to share that article, and it gives you some ideas of how you can learn to find safety and how you can learn to help the other person find safety when you're having these moments of clash. And she's also going to share a YouTube video that is an excerpt from my next book. It was a really beautiful process in Corfu, Greece. I was with a whole bunch of other writers, and we had a writer's circle and we did readings for each other. And the next book is all about love. And why do we find it so hard? Is it our trauma or is it the context of the world? What's going on? And so the video is Commentary on Love #1, where I explore just that. So if you're curious, take a look. I've nearly finished writing the book, not quite, hopefully by the end of the year. So I'll just pause, Marianne, and ask if there have been any questions come through.
Yeah, so there's a few. Surya Kala would actually like to see if you could expand more on the trauma bond as you were talking about it earlier. And there's been two other messages that came through in the chat.
Okay, well, I'll talk a little bit more about a trauma bond. There is so much content available on this online from so many people in this space. So please do have a bit of a Google and a look. But essentially, a trauma bond will occur when we have learnt that relationship or intimacy or love come with certain harmful traits. So we may learn that love is volatile, that love hurts us, that love abandons us, that love will always be less than what we deserve. And if we create these unconscious organizing principles, if they develop inside us, because that's the map that we've been shown, quite often later in life, we will unconsciously seek similar because we've learnt that that's what relationship is. So, for example, we might find ourselves with a partner who is very neglectful, or a partner who is very shaming, or a partner who harms us. And if that's happening, because we've learned that that's part of relationship, we will tend to stay because we think, well, that's just part of it. Or we will tend to self pathologize and work so hard to have the other person not hurt us or to give us more. So we will end up twisting ourselves in knots and self abandoning. I don't know if anyone's experienced or had someone they know that's in a relationship that is clearly harmful, but that person really can't feel to leave because they're in that cycle. And quite often, when somebody exits a trauma bond, there is an incredible amount of trauma content to process. And I think it's one of the most difficult pieces of healing work to do because you're really going back to that core relational wounding. I hope that answers. Let me know if there's a follow-up question. I'll maybe take two more questions, Marianne. Thank you.
Okay. Trish is asking if you can talk about owning the right pain.
I don't understand the question. Are you able to elaborate on that a little bit more so I can answer it better? Because I don't quite understand the core of the question. So I'll wait for you to do that. And maybe while we're waiting for that to come through, Marianne, you could you could give me one more while we're
Yeah.
waiting.
And Ronnie is asking if you can talk about parent-adult child trauma bonding dynamics?
Oh, this is a complex one. Have you got 6 hours? Let's touch on it. When we are an adult and we are relating with a parent, that relational template has been set for a very long time, right? I'm in my 40s, so my template with my parents has been set for over 40 years. So that's some really tough stuff to unweave. And if there has been relational trauma or childhood trauma, there are so many different manifestations it can take. And as an adult, when we're in relationship with a parent, it's very complex because we're not little children anymore. And once we do our healing work, there's this point where we realize, A, this person doesn't have so much power over me anymore. So even if perhaps they're relating in some ways that are not the most compassionate or the most kind, the level of authority or power they have over us is quite reduced in most cases, not all. And so beginning to unlink that, so moving from our baby selves, our child selves, into owning our mature adult self can be really, really helpful. Another piece is around setting healthy boundaries. And these boundaries will look and feel different depending on who you are and what's going on in your life and also your intentions. So, for some people, it is very important and meaningful to be able to create some kind of repair and closeness. For others, it's more important to create a bit of a distance. And I think learning to relate through distance can be one of the most tricky and sometimes painful things to do, but it's where a lot of people land who are processing their trauma, who have grown up in volatile dynamics, because you have to learn to live and relate with a bit of space and not get that deep, deep, deep attunement. That is what we all crave. Like we all want that from our family and particularly our parents. And some people who try very hard to set boundaries and are doing their healing work actually choose to end relationships. And so it's not for me or for anyone else to say what is right or wrong, but to understand where does my path of healing want to take me and how important is it to repair this dynamic and how close do I want it to be? So it's quite a complex piece. I hope that answers. Marianne, was there a follow-up from the question that I wasn't quite sure of?
Yes, she said when people react to other people's emotions with instructions on how the person emoting should react, rather than managing their own feelings and investigating why they want to control others, or when people intellectualize their actions rather than feel them and instead spray their emotions all over others.
Okay, that gives me a little bit more context. Thank you. Again, this is a really tricky one. I think it's important to understand that there are stages of healing work, and many of us are relating with people that are on all different stages of the spectrum. So, when somebody is holding a lot of trauma and they do not have the capacity to contain it, or they don't have the self regulating skills, whether that's regulating nervous system or regulating emotion, what will commonly happen is the leaking or the projection of the trauma content onto other people. And of course, this can happen in many dimensions, both personal and then also at work and in the greater community. Um, Something that can also happen is the turning other into a perpetrator. So everybody's out to get me, everybody's wrong, and I need you to behave in a different way in order for me to feel safe. And this is the really interesting, tricky bit. Because if I change the way that I'm living and experiencing relating in order to make someone else safe, but I self-abandon my own safety and my own authenticity, then there's not a win, there's a lose. So one of the things that happens as we heal is we learn how to show up with a do no harm approach, but we also don't take on other people's stuff to metabolize unless we are being paid to support them through that process, which most of us are not. And so it's really tricky and it's really nuanced. And again, this is about boundaries, and this is also about psychological sovereignty, which I talk and teach a lot about in my human intelligence leadership program. Very commonly, when we've gone through our trauma and when we've got this noisy, quite effed up word, excuse my language, just throwing us all kinds of information and telling us to be all these things that we are not, we lose sovereignty. And so when someone is projecting all of their stuff onto us, we can start to question who we are, our value, our worth, or the way we should carry ourselves through this world. And psychological sovereignty is actually about learning, well, the way this person's expressing or what they're projecting onto me is theirs. It is not mine. And then depending on the role and depending on our capacity, which will change any given day, we can choose how much or little we want to engage. But when we stop metabolizing other people's stuff or enabling their bad behavior, that's when we start to shift the relational social matrix of our world. And quite now, a lot I see that people are trying to metabolize each other's wounds and then going into self-depletion, and then a new cycle begins. Let me know if you have a follow-up question. This is a really big piece, and a lot of my work in the leadership space stems around this piece. So thank you for bringing it into the conversation. Marianne, is there one more question?
So on LinkedIn, Marie is asking about the future of relationships. Surely that must start with self.
This is such an interesting chicken and egg question, isn't it? We tend to live in a world where we're taught the self goes first, and it's our responsibility to do everything. But if we think back to the way we develop as babies, that's just not how humans work. When we're babies, we don't know how to self-regulate. And it's actually through primarily our relationship with our mother, but also our relationship with our father, our family, and as we grow our greater community, that we learn what safety looks like, that we learn what authenticity looks like, that we learn what boundaries look like, that we learn what intimacy looks like. And if we've never been given a map for that, we will not know how. So it's very easy for those of us that are at a certain place in our journey to say, I did it myself, why can't you? But if people haven't been given that map or that relational blueprint, they can't. And this is one of the big pieces of trauma and where so much re-traumatization happens, because we can have an expectation that somebody can be a certain way that they just don't have access to. And again, then we bring it back to ourselves. Where am I in my journey? How much capacity, how much resource, how much power do I have? And can I share it or can I not? So these are all really complex questions, and I want us to start thinking about them in complex ways. Where I would love to see relationship get to more and more is that more of us do commit to our own healing work so that we have the capacity to show up and share our power, share our capacity, share our light. But I also want us to learn that sometimes we just don't have it. And so part of healing is learning that we become the resources that are lacking in the world. And so coming back to the core of your question, in the end, it does begin here. But I just want us to be mindful of this relational piece and this sort of DEI piece as well. Thank you so much. Okay, let's move on to the next section. Please keep these questions coming, as you can hear and feel like it's your questions that allow this to go deeper into all these sort of nuanced pockets. And I'm really, really grateful for the engagement. Thank you. Let's talk about culture, community, and leadership. A really important space and very relevant to so many of us right now. Trauma does not wait at home for us while we go to work each day. It doesn't wait for us in the car or sit quietly on the bus or in the corner of an office. It comes into every single interaction. Many of our microcultures and communities are buzzing with trauma. It's like we're swimming in the collective pool of it. It's a bit funky. The way we judge, criticize, polarize, protect, shame, blame, pathologize, that drama at work, the secret whispers chain of gossip, the power play, the silence, expectation that we'll just show up and get on with it, contained with a smile on our face. No wonder we are in a mental health crisis. No wonder people are popping pills or getting high. No wonder suicide rates are escalating. No wonder people are getting sick with strange autoimmune diseases. Then there are those who are quitting. leaving, saying, this does not serve me anymore. There are also the smart leaders who see that things need to change and are committed to trauma-informed culture transformation. So there's a few things that come along as part of trauma-informed culture transformation. The first is becoming trauma conscious or trauma aware. What is trauma and how is it showing up in the complex pool of my people? The next is a relational intelligence approach, a commitment to showing up with deeper intelligence, owning the position of power and finding ways to distribute it. And again, this is a huge part of my work in the leadership space. You know, when you're dealing with somebody at work that is totally triggered and totally unavailable to listen in a rational way, that person is experiencing trauma. And we can shame and blame, or we can disconnect, or we can get really curious about how's showing up and how can I maybe help bring that person online. And the more of us that lead like this, the more harmonic our cultures will become. Trauma-informed culture transformation also calls for system redesign, because a lot of the ways our systems have been built or developed come from trauma. They are very reactive. They are very lack-based and deprivation-oriented, and they tend to make us feel really oppressed, really unseen, and really overworked. So we can't just ask people to heal. We have to create or develop a system or a workplace or a corporate structure that actually empowers them to do that. Because what happens if we tell people to go heal, but then the system says, you can't bloody heal? Then people become more oppressed and disenfranchised than ever. And we're seeing this all around the world. Trauma-informed leadership also asks us to prepare for the fallout when new boundaries and expectations are set. So in an organization or a community of any kind, once the game changes to become trauma-informed, we start saying no to a lot and we start expecting better. And once those boundaries are in place, as I mentioned earlier, there will be a fallout. There will be people who do not like the new regime. There will be people who decide to leave. There will be people who get very angry, and management has to prepare to deal with that as part of the journey to restoration. And the biggest thing that's part of trauma-informed leadership transformation is as leaders committing to our own healing work. So we can't show up and say, do as I say, but I'm going to do differently. We actually have to show up and embody what it means to process our trauma, to contain ourselves, to move with a certain level of relational intelligence, to not turn up burnt out all the time. So that embodiment piece is perhaps the most important. Regenerative and restorative practices will often slow down productivity for a time and therefore profit. The goal is to redesign the collective culture and the business, if it is a business, to operate in sustainable and human-centered ways. This level of redesign, it's always messy. It always takes time. It will always include some kind of loss, some brand identity work, redefining core values and best practices. And this kind of innovation will reshape our commercial world. Now, I'm going to pause again here for questions. This is a really big, complex, messy piece. And while I'm waiting to see if there's any questions, Marianne's going to share a little bit more about this human intelligence leadership work that I do. And I've done many podcasts on this space, and I've asked her to share one podcast in particular that I did with a great leader in Singapore that really kind of went into the nuts and bolts of it all in a really gritty way. And so if you're curious about this sort of more workspace piece, how does trauma work create innovation at work, then I really encourage you to listen to this particular podcast. Thanks for sharing those, Marianne. Are there any more questions? I'm going to pour myself some tea.
Kim is asking, she says that I'm finding that realizing that I am a fractional person with a sovereign is helping me to heal. How can I frame this concept to help me more?
Can you say that again? Sorry, I need to digest it.
Sorry. I'm finding that realizing that I am a fractional person with a sovereign is helping me to heal. How can I frame this concept to help me more?
I'm not 100% sure that I'm getting it right, but I'm going to try based on the way I'm processing the reflection and the question. So we are all fragmented. We are all very complex creatures, and many of us have different parts that have different wounds, different things to process, have different needs, different desires, and learning to understand ourselves as fragmented is really helpful and I think essential for processing our trauma, but finding a sense of ease within the world. And when it comes to sovereignty, it's a tricky one. I believe until we each feel sovereign, we will not feel a sense of well-being or ease in the world. So if we feel any kind of oppression, we will not feel totally vital. And if we are oppressing others, they will not feel totally vital. And then because we're all sort of connected and interacted, our sovereignty cannot come at the cost of someone else's sovereignty. And this piece is all about power. And if you're curious about this piece, I encourage you to look at the Laws of Peace and Power, which is the whole last part of my book, Why Am I Like This, where I explore how can we create this world where we all feel a sense of sovereignty, where we claim it for ourselves, but where we also make sure we are not impinging on other people's sovereignty. It's this interplay between self-care and self-abandonment. It's a very, very tricky space. And I know for my life, it's been such a complex journey, but sort of living by these laws, they're not really laws, like they're principles, has helped me to feel like I am well in this world. And so it's not just about what do I need to be well, but how can I make sure that I am not taking anything from anyone that would cause them to be unwell? And this is where our healing work becomes social. This is where we become mindful of our social footprint, and it's not just about us, it's where we rejoin humanity. I hope that answers the question. If there is a follow up or a reframe of the question, let me know. Thank you. Is there one more, Marianne?
Yep. Patricia is asking, oh, sorry. What about when someone is causing psychological harm and management ask other to work it out within the person, but the person has been doing this for years, causing a lot of stuff to avoid them or leave?
This is very complex. It's happening all over, all of the time. Ideally, we want the people in power or the authorities to protect us, and quite often they don't. And when this doesn't happen, it can tug on or create re-traumatization if we have lived through other experiences, both within our family unit and or in a cultural or community sense, where we have not been protected, where we've been crying out for help and we've been ignored. It can really take us to very deep, awful places. One of the most important things when navigating complex dynamics, particularly at work, is to find awareness and then also to find agency. And this is not an ideal response, but I think it's where we're at in the world, and it's really sad. And these are the kind of conversations and inquiry that allow us to start reimagining it and making it different. So if your boss at work is just not listening and will not provide support, number one, we want to check, is this tugging on deeper trauma stuff for me? And can I put the past in the past and process it there and come to the present and realize that this person is not supporting me? And then second is to be able to make a decision, well, can I repair this or readjust this here? And if not, if the harm is keeping to continue, am I able to exit? Am I able to leave? And another sad truth in this very complex, dire space is sometimes it's not possible. And it's similar in terms of this sort of abusive work dynamic to what happens in many abusive relationships. Somebody doesn't have the resources to leave. So it's a really complex issue. Thank you for bringing it again. We could have many hours talking about this. Is there one more question, Marianne?
Yeah, so Jackie's asking, I've worked for 30 years in the trauma field and now supervise practitioners. It is so common that the field itself exploits the workforce, those who often, due to their trauma, deny themselves. work-life balance, adequate support at work, etc. What have you found helps to hold the field more to account for this?
This is a big one, Jackie. Thanks for bringing it into the little community here. The healthcare system is very broken, as are so many other systems in the world. When we ask clinicians to work full time, serving people with trauma, that on its own is not sustainable. And it will trigger states of burnout and therefore not the best care. And it will usually cause past trauma to come into the room and be transferred or projected into the therapeutic relationship. Um, and then if you think that many people who go on the path of becoming a practitioner of some kind, and I am one of them, have very strong wounded healer inside them, this archetype. And so that also causes us to not have good boundaries and not look after ourselves. And I don't know if we can hold the system accountable, or I guess we could try, but I don't know if it's going to work. And so for me, it comes back to me. I know that this is the amount of healing work or care-driven work that I can do where I stay within my capacity. And anything else beyond that needs to be a no. And a lot of the young practitioners or clinician that I train or that I work with, I always encourage you, please work part-time in this field. Please go and get another revenue stream. And I think that this is the future of healthcare, not just for therapists, but all clinicians and anybody in a helping and a healing role, because it's not just in the clinical space, it's in the social space, it's in education, it's in first response. And for that to happen on a mass level probably isn't going to happen in our lifetime. But what we can begin to do is embody it for ourselves. And we're starting to see this more and more of clinicians who decide they're going to work part-time only. And I think it's an energy thing, it's a capacity thing. To me, it feels too impossible, but I guess nothing's impossible. For me, it feels too impossible to try and tell the global healthcare landscape this is how it needs to be. I'm just going to do it for myself. And anyone who asks me, I'm going to say this is how I stay well. I hope that helps. When I started in the field, I was seeing 7 or 8 clients a day, 6 days a week. It was not okay. Within a couple of years, I was totally burnt out by it. Now I only see a handful of clients 2 half days a week. And of course, I'm doing so many other things, teaching and writing and all of this, but that's where my sweet spot is. And that's where I can give the best care where I don't hurt myself. I'll take one more question, please, Marianne, and then we will move on.
Yep. Belinda is saying that she's in the midst of regeneration right now, and it does at times feel a little lonely whenever she shares about her recovery journey with people around her. How can she hold space and compassion for herself and others and be patient in the meantime for change to happen?
Healing can be one of the loneliest processes, particularly in early stages, because all of a sudden the self we were ceases to exist, and then the relationships we had don't quite fit in many cases. And some of our people can kind of get us, but so often many people can't get us or don't have the capacity or consciousness to listen to us or hold us or meet us, and this can feel deeply lonely. So the first thing is to sit with and metabolize that loneliness, that grief. Often it's in this space of metabolizing our loneliness where we learn to reorient to people and places who can meet us where we are and who are emotionally available to connect in any of the ways that we wish to connect. But it also does take time to make new connections. And there are so many ways to seek them out. But we are living in the age of loneliness right now, with everybody stuck behind their screens. We are all on our screens right now. And the world is becoming very insular. And because so many people are protective, people tend to be less likely to open themselves to new connections, particularly in big cities. I believe, having traveled around in villages and small communities, there's far more of an openness for connection. So I suppose sit with the loneliness, but also keep reaching out to people within communities that you feel you want to orient towards. But gosh, it takes time. I have been there and continue to be there, you know, with an international move and traveling all over the world. But I think the loneliness, it's a portal towards finding the kinds of connection that truly nourish us. Thank you. I can see there are some more questions, but I'm going to move on to the sort of the last section here. Let's talk about the future of health and mental health care. What does innovation look like here? Now, this is the space where I began my career as a practitioner and also a clinic director in Asia. And while my work has now traversed into so many different spaces, I have a deep passion to explore healthcare innovation. One of the things that will happen when we innovate here is that, and it's starting to happen, is we exit the paradigm of quick diagnosis and pathology. So we stop labeling and writing scripts and telling people this is who you are and now you are your diagnosis. We begin to look at a safety versus threat paradigm. So just like with the personal innovation, when it comes to sort of healthcare, and instead of this is a sickness, we want to explore what level of safety or threat is this person experiencing right now as a core inquiry. And we also want to bring system exploration to this. What would be creating that person's experience of safety or threat? So this is a reframe as we begin to innovate healthcare. We're going to look less individually and more socially. So when we see a beautiful human with either a physical or a mental health problem, we're not just going to look at that person. We're going to look at the fabric of their world. We're going to look at their story. We're going to look at turning points in their story. We're going to explore who they are and why they have become the way they've come. Not just take at face value, this is who you are and this is what you're experiencing right now. We'll also be looking at the role of nervous system regulation and social resources as core to all care. So rather than here is the medicine or here is some breath techniques, we're going to understand, well, what does this person need to help regulate their nervous system and what ways can this be supported socially? Because remember, there is this relational, social, systemic piece that does inform most physical and mental illness. Not all, but most. We'll also be, as part of this healthcare innovation, exploring the role of both the practitioner and the system in re-traumatization. This happens in treatment rooms and in front offices every single day, where a person comes in actually just aching for some relational safety, aching for a place to land, aching to be seen, and all they feel is dismissed, unheard, and wildly unsafe, which repels them right back into re-experiencing their trauma. So this piece is going to be a really big part of transformational innovation in the future of health and mental health care. So those of you that are interested in this space, please do check out my book, Why Am I Like This? Because I talk about this, I write about this a lot. I spent many, many, many years lost and trapped in the Australian healthcare system. And when I went to Singapore, I worked in it, and I've been working it in the US for the last few years as well. Marianne's going to share the link to that. And she's also going to share the link to another podcast, which is, if you're really interested in this systemic piece, it's actually from my podcast, Decontextualize, that I created a couple of years ago. We just did one season. And the last one is called TEDx and Truth. And if you're really sort of wanting to go into the grid of it, I encourage you to listen to that. Okay, Marianne, I'll take perhaps two more questions and it's nearly time to finish. It's gone so quickly, our hour together.
Yeah, there hasn't been questions but comments. So Gil on LinkedIn says, this is so meaningful, so worthwhile to listen to. Thank you. And Trish also has shared a few comments in the chat that you are the first person I have heard use the term sovereignty in this way, which is part of my nation's essential values. Thank you. She also mentioned that colonialism and extractive capitalism require us to abandon ourselves to be successful. That's about it. So if anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to raise it up.
Thank you for all those reflections and for choosing to show up and share your time and your presence with me. I'm really grateful. Um, I've been sharing in this space a really long time now, and it's beautiful to see the interest growing and the openness growing. It feels like humanity is ready or is actually like screaming for this deep systemic work to happen, and that there are more of us that are at a point where we can hold it because, gosh, it's heavy, gosh, it's big. And I'm really passionate about walking this path together, paving the way slowly and sustainably. The thing about innovation is nobody really knows what the future's going to look like. And that's terrifying. And sometimes we're going to start carving out a new path that's completely the wrong way, because we don't know. We're kind of testing, we're seeing, we're trying, but at least we're moving, at least we're evolving. And the more of us that are there to champion each other and cherish each other and reflect to each other, the more easeful it's going to be. So thank you so much for showing up. I'll look forward to connecting with some more of you again next year. This is going to be the last sort of open live session. If you are interested to learn further with me, there are so many ways to learn. I will be teaching my somatic training, trauma-informed relational somatics, in both the USA, in LA in February, and in Singapore in March. I hope to see some of you there. I love working with parents, and we're going to be running the Trauma Conscious Parent, a two-part workshop in Singapore in March. It used to be just for mothers, but this time we are opening it to both men and women. And if you are not able to get to an in-person training, there are so many short online workshops that you can access. There is my book, and of course, I show up really regularly to sort of share this work on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and YouTube too. So you can engage with me wherever you are on your journey. Thank you so much for your time, your presence, your open minds and hearts, and have a beautiful day or evening wherever you are in the world. Bye.